my solidarity with the people of Egypt, Tunis, and West Africa. Please notice my wristband, green wristband, hanging around me. Both were stolen. And I would like the panel's response to the dilemma that I believe the people in the region who are trying to get their rights and remain independent. The U.S. foreign policy, aided and controlled perhaps by Israel, allows only either collaborator or being suppressed. And I believe this is a very wrong-headed foreign policy that the U.S. pursues, but how do the people in the region should free themselves from this either or colonial choice?
Okay, well, I think that's a very good question. How do you free yourself from this binary way of thinking about things? Anyone would like to take that on? Ahmed, okay, go ahead.
I think your point is right. I mean, the problem that many ordinary people in the region see is that the West deal with them in a way that there are only two alternatives. You either have dictators that we can deal with and do business with, or you would have Islamists or some kind of Waco regime that would certainly start a whole-out war on the West. And this has been the picture. Now, the problem with that story is that what we're seeing in the streets in Cairo, we saw in Tunisia, is that we're seeing a movement that is not ideologically driven, and therefore it is very difficult to sell that kind of scenario, that kind of story to people in the West who are now far more informed about the region precisely because of the revolution in telecommunication, in internet services and others. Now people in the United States, for example, no longer depend on CNN for their news, and that's very significant. They don't depend on Fox News either. So, and that is very important development, and I think that is really positive development. But the road is way long, and I think the change would come, but it would take some time. And it is nice to see that even though it's late, that some Western leaders and have been, not the people in the West seem to pick it and understood this development much faster than their leaders. But some leaders in Europe, particularly in France, after what happened in Tunisia, they didn't notice until it's already done. But they started to sort of try to understand what happened, and there are some positive development in the West. That's it. Look, these people are fed up with these regimes, and they have had enough. And it is now opportunity for the West to treat the people in the region with respect, and I think that is a good start for peace in the world, not just in the region, but throughout the world.
Very good, thank you. Do you have anything from up there in the back? Yeah.
We're no stranger to religious differences in the United States or throughout the rest of the world. But as I read about events in the Islamic world, the impression I get is there are some rather severe theological differences within Islam which translate themselves into political differences. Am I correct? In other words, is this an insuperable barrier, or is there some bridge where the theological distinctions won't be erased, but can be overcome for the sake of political unity?
Great, thank you. Mahal, would you like to?
Thank you. Yeah. One of the things I think that all of the discussions that we've had for the last hour and a half, one of the things they've all pointed out to is that the new movements in the Middle East, the popular movements that we're seeing, whether they're in Tunisia or in Egypt or in Jordan or in Yemen or in Palestine, they're surprisingly multi-faith, multi-ethnic in their composition, partly because of the generational change that's taking place, and partly because of the overriding domestic concerns. Political oppression knows no religion. Political suppression region knows no ethnicity. These autocratic regimes take they express their autocracy equally among Christians and Muslims, among Sunnis and Shia, among different ethnic groups. And so the organizations that are coming out, or the groups of people that are coming out, are setting aside those differences to a large extent. Now, will those differences reemerge once these regimes are overthrown? That's a separate question that in some ways remains to be seen. But right now, I think one of the striking things about these pro-democracy movements that we're seeing in the region is that they are surprisingly, not surprisingly, but that they are very much unifying.
And Scott would like to respond to that.
Since we can't have a we can't have a panel without mentioning the country Iraq on the Middle East. If we look even among Shiism, the most influential Ayatollah now is Sistani in Iraq, and he does not support the regime, the type of regime that is in Iran right now, the Velayat-e-Faqih. That's not, he hasn't been supportive of that. And so here you have, a very fascinating break within the same school of Islam among prominent leaders. And so there is a lot of diversity. You have some Muslims who don't think democracy is desirable. That's true. That's a fact. You have many, I think more, who think it is. And so these things will get played out, but I think right now, as everyone has said, this is not really an Islamic thing right now. This is really a people thing. So, thanks.
Very good. All right. Dylan, do you want to run up there, and then we'll come back.
Thank you very much. I want to ask you about the different scenarios regarding the impact of Arab societies uprising on Arab-Israeli conflict.
Maybe Dr. Susser and then Mahat talk about this.
Well, really, it depends. It really depends on the outcome of these uprisings and who emerges in power. If the end result of the uprising in Egypt, for example, is a pluralistic democratic state, focusing on Egypt's national interests and not on the Arab-Israeli conflict, then I think that would be very beneficial in the long run to the region as a whole. The peace with Israel would remain, and Egypt and Israel could be prosperous neighbors. If, however, this ends and people are now saying, well, this isn't an Islamic revolution, and if it isn't, that I think gives greater chance for progress to be made on the Arab-Israeli issue. If it does turn out to be an Islamic revolution, then I think the impact on the Arab-Israeli peace process will be negative. The Islamists do not hide their attitude towards the peace with Israel, and if they become the moving force in these countries, the impact will be negative. Let me add one other general kind of statement to some of the things that have been said here before. I think Israelis look at what is happening in Egypt and elsewhere, in one respect, with a sigh of relief. We are not the issue. And those who seek to suggest somehow that we are, don't realize that what we have before us is the beginnings of some kind of domestic revolution, where at long last the peoples of the Middle East are taking responsibility for their own fate. It's about time. That is good for them, and it is good for Israel in the long run as well. The story I just heard about the gas that Israel bought from Egypt at 1/7 of the price and sold it back at 7 times the price. I have no idea where this story comes from. I have no idea what the source for the story is. I have no idea what the veracity of the story is. It doesn't sound good when people talk that way about Jews.
Talking about Israel, not Jews. Please do not confuse the two. Zionism and Judaism are completely separate. And I would like to point a comment that Netanyahu made after stating that he supports democracy, as you say, after stating that he supports democracy in the Middle East after being shocked about things happening in Egypt, and this was reported in Ynet, he then said this ominous statement.
that Israel had put unspecified, quote, security arrangements in place. Quote, a peace agreement does not guarantee the existence of peace. So in order to protect it and ourselves in cases in which the agreement disappears or is violated due to a regime change on the other side, we protect it with security arrangements on the ground. And then he did not give any further details about these security assurances and was not even asked about them.
Okay, let's, all right, well, let's
What's
stop
surprising
it.
about that?
Let's stop for a second.
Because you have to know the history.
Wait, let's stop for a second and pull these 2 points together, okay? That so much depends on how things play out in the next days and in the next weeks, okay? So there are different visions of how this impacts Israeli-Egyptian and Israeli-Palestinian relations, depending on what happens on the ground in the next couple of weeks. Ahmad wanted to say something.
I think if you look, for instance, at tourism, that this is something that might play out in case of Morocco and Tunisia, and it's already playing out in the case of Tunisia. Generally, I would say a big part of the tourists who go to Tunisia are Israelis, and this has been something that's been going on between the government of Tunisia and the government of Israel. And recently, a lot of the tourists actually have been moved to, even religious tourism have been moved to Morocco. So that's something that might influence the economy of Tunisia probably in the future. Whether the future government will maintain those links, we don't know, but this is something that definitely relates to religious tourism that connects Jews of Tunisia with Tunisia.
Okay.